It was past midnight when I noticed my gas gauge was dangerously close to empty. I had been driving for hours on a long, lonely stretch of the highway, and there hadn't been a gas station in miles. My phone had lost signal ages ago, and there was no sign of civilization anywhere nearby. The darkness of the highway felt suffocating, with nothing but the occasional stretch of trees and the sound of my car's engine to keep me company. As I drove on, hoping to find a gas station before I ran out of fuel, I finally spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. It read, "Last Stop Gas Station." The place looked old and run down, but I didn't care. At this point, I would have taken anything. I pulled into the gravel lot, the headlights casting long shadows against the pumps. The station looked like it had been frozen in time, dusty with chipped paint and rusted metal, like it hadn't been touched in years. Still, there were faint lights inside, so it couldn't be completely abandoned, right? I parked near the pump and got out, stretching my legs. The air was still, too still, and the night seemed unnaturally quiet. I walked over to the pump and grabbed the nozzle, but the screen was dead. No power. Frustrated, I glanced at the gas station building. The lights were on inside, though dim, so I figured I'd have to go in and pay. As I approached the door, I noticed something strange, a symbol scratched into the wood. It looked like a circle with a jagged line running through it, but I shrugged it off. Maybe just graffiti. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The station was small, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and something stale. The shelves were mostly empty, with faded snacks and drinks that looked like they'd been sitting there for years. At the back of the room was a counter with an old cash register, and behind it sat a man. He was slumped over, wearing a dirty baseball cap that obscured his face. I cleared my throat as I approached. "Hey, I need to pay for gas." The man didn't respond. He just sat there, completely still. I moved closer, hesitating. Excuse me?" I tried again. He stirred slightly, lifting his head just enough to meet my gaze. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. His eyes, though, they were the worst part. They were dull, lifeless, like he was looking right through me. I shivered. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered under his breath. So quietly I almost missed it. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just turned his head slightly toward the wall behind him. Curious, I followed his gaze, and then my stomach dropped. The walls were lined with photos, dozens of them. Old, faded pictures of people standing in front of cars, smiling like they were on some kind of road trip. But there was something off about the photos. All of the people looked like they had been cut out of magazines, except their eyes. Their eyes were either blurred or scratched out. In every single picture, the faces had these hollow, black smudges where their eyes should have been. I stepped back, suddenly feeling very uncomfortable. "Look, I just need gas," I stammered, my voice shaky, but when I turned back to the man, he was gone. My heart started racing. How could he have disappeared so quickly? The chair where he'd been sitting was empty, the light above the counter flickering as if something had disturbed it. I backed away toward the door, my palms sweating, trying to shake the unease that gripped me. When I reached the door and yanked on the handle, it wouldn't open. Panic set in as I tugged harder, but it was stuck, as if it had been locked from the outside. I glanced around the small, dusty room, trying to figure out what was happening. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence was deafening. My thoughts raced, every instinct in me screaming to leave, but I couldn't. I slammed my hand against the door in frustration, desperate to get out. Just then, I heard something, a faint whisper, almost like the wind. It was coming from somewhere behind me, but when I spun around, there was no one there. The room was empty, still as a graveyard. My breathing was shallow, and I felt a sudden coldness in the air, like a draft coming from nowhere. I scanned the room, heart thumping in my chest, but nothing moved. It was just me, and that wall of strange, eyeless photos. Then I remembered my car. I didn't need to pay. I could just leave, get in my car, and drive until I found somewhere else, anywhere else. My keys were already in my pocket, So I took one last look around the room, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and made a run for it. The door suddenly gave way, and I burst outside into the cold night air, breathing hard. I ran straight to my car, jumped in, and turned the key. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled out of the lot without looking back. As I sped down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been terribly wrong with that place. I didn't know what that man meant by, "You shouldn't be here," but I was certain of one thing: I wasn't going back to find out. The highway was dark and empty, just as it had been before. But something felt different now. The air was thick with tension, and even though I was miles away from that gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I stopped at a motel an hour later, still rattled from the experience, that I noticed something chilling. On the passenger seat next to me, where I'd thrown my jacket, there was something I hadn't seen before: a small, faded photograph. It was of me, standing by my car at the gas station. Just like the others, my eyes were missing. It was late, probably past midnight, and I had been driving for hours without a break. My eyes were starting to blur, and my neck ached from staring at the endless stretch of highway in front of me. I was on my way back from a family gathering, and the trip had taken longer than expected. The worst part? My gas light had been blinking for the last 10 miles, and there wasn't a sign of a gas station anywhere. The highway was completely deserted. Not a single car had passed me in the last hour, and the radio signal had faded into static. I kept glancing at my phone, but I was deep in a rural area with no signal and no hope of GPS. I wasn't sure where I was, and to be honest, I was starting to get nervous. I didn't want to be stuck out here in the middle of nowhere, with no gas and no way to call for help. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I saw a flicker of light ahead. It was faint, but as I got closer, I could make out a small gas station sitting by the side of the road. It looked old, like something out of the 70s, with a single flickering neon sign that read, "Gas and Go." The building was small, with cracked windows and rusted gas pumps, but I didn't care. I needed gas, and this was my only option. I pulled up to the pump and shut off the engine. The air was cool, and a light fog had started to roll in, making everything look hazy. There were no other cars in the lot, and the place seemed abandoned, but the lights were on inside the small convenience store. I grabbed my wallet, got out of the car, and walked toward the pump. I lifted the nozzle and placed it into the tank, but when I squeezed the handle, nothing happened. "Great," I muttered under my breath. The pump wasn't working. I looked around for any signs of life, but saw nothing. Figuring I'd have to go inside to pay, I headed toward the store. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a bell above the door jingled. The inside of the store was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves holding old snacks and drinks. There was an odd smell in the air, like something stale and faintly rotten. I walked up to the counter, where an old cash register sat, but there was no one behind it. I rang the small bell on the counter and waited. A few seconds later, I heard a shuffle from the back room. An old man emerged, wearing a dirty shirt and an old trucker cap. He looked disheveled, his eyes glassy and distant, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Need gas," I said, trying to sound casual despite the odd feeling creeping up my spine. "The pump isn't working." The old man stared at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ain't worked in a while," he said in a raspy voice, "but I can get it going for you." He shuffled toward the back again without another word. I stood there awkwardly, waiting. The whole place felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The lights above me flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. I glanced at the shelves and noticed how outdated everything looked, like it had been sitting there for years. There was a stack of newspapers by the door, and when I picked one up, I realized it was from 1992. Excuse me," I called out toward the back room, but the old man didn't respond. I set the newspaper down and walked back outside, deciding I'd rather wait by the car. As I stepped outside, the fog had thickened and the temperature had dropped. It was unsettling how quiet it was. I could barely see beyond the pumps now, the fog wrapping around the station like a blanket. I walked back to my car, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Just as I reached for the door handle, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, turning slowly to look behind me, but there was nothing. Just the fog and the faint glow of the station's lights. Then I heard it again. A soft, almost unintelligible whisper, like someone speaking from far away. My heart started to race. I scanned the area around me, but the fog made it impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead. I leaned closer to the car, gripping the handle tighter. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the gas station's flickering lights. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching against the gravel. They were coming from somewhere in the fog, getting closer. My stomach tightened with fear. "Who's there?" I shouted, backing up toward the car. No response. The footsteps stopped. I quickly opened the car door and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine, but when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, trying again, but the car wouldn't start. Panic set in. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the fog behind the car. A dark shape, barely visible through the mist. But when I looked back again, it was gone. I sat there, frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no signal. I was completely alone. Just then, the gas station lights flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the silence suffocating. The only light now was the faint glow from my car's dashboard. And then, the whispers returned. Louder this time, closer. They seemed to be coming from all around me, like voices pressing in on me from the fog. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt urgent, menacing. Without thinking, I bolted from the car and ran toward the gas station. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away from whatever was out there. As I reached the door, I slammed it behind me and locked it, breathing heavily. The inside of the station was completely dark now, but I could still hear the whispers. They were inside with me. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. The shadows seemed to move in the darkness, and my mind raced with fear. I stumbled toward the counter, hoping to find something, anything to defend myself with. But as I reached for the counter, I heard a voice, clear this time, and right behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. The old man was gone, and the room was empty. I was alone. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in pictures, old, faded photographs of people standing in front of the gas station, families, travelers, couples. All of them had the same vacant, glassy eyes as the old man, and in the center of the wall was a large mirror. In the mirror, I saw myself, but behind me, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A dark silhouette with empty eyes, just like in the photos. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I don't remember how I got to my car or how I managed to start it, but somehow I did. I floored the gas and sped away, not looking back. Not until I was miles down the highway. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, the gas station was gone. There was nothing there but empty road and fog.